I'm Courtney Smith.
And I'm Elise Sharp.
And we are two nerds who are here to make Shakespeare easier to understand.
In this podcast, we will explore as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which the plays were written, and how his plays are viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as theater makers, how his plays can be responsibly performed today, all while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to bardolatry.
So, Shakespeare, anyone?
Hi, listeners. Want to support Shakespeare, anyone? Visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. Now, onto the episode. Hi, Elise.
Hi, Courtney.
How are you today?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm doing well, but I will admit, and this is kind of like a behind-the-scenes sort of thing, I am so excited to be back from our hiatus that we took in between Julius Caesar and this new play, As You Like It. But it was a little bit of a challenge to get back into the reading kind of energy of like, okay, let's sit down and read an academic article. It was a little bit like focus was challenging because I was enjoying my hiatus from this kind of podcast work.
Yeah. For those who don't know, we work really hard to prep the synopsis and stuff to chew on episodes so that while you are enjoying those, we are taking a little behind the scenes break in terms of researching, writing, recording, editing episodes. So we just got back from our trips. Some big things have happened. I have moved. So if my sound is a little bit different, that's because I'm still figuring out where in my new place I'm going to record and what the space needs in order to get the sound back to where we like it. So if I sound a little bit different, that's partially why.
Yeah, this is the first time ever in Shakespeare Anyone podcast history that we have held before our discussion episodes for room tone.
I think we've had to hold for like one-off room tone, but it's the first time we're in such a different room. Yeah, it's been a minute since that first time that we recorded room tone. And that's a little behind the scenes magic for you. But first things first, Courtney, what are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about fools, specifically one fool, the fool Touchstone.
Yes, so we've previously looked at fools, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but we're going to really deep dive on Touchstone and what makes him a little bit unique as a fool in Shakespeare. But first, we've got some housekeeping to do. If you want to hear more, though, about what we did on our summer hiatuses, we shared some behind-the-scenes photos. You can also see some of the struggles that I personally had to record the synopsis over on our Patreon. We shared some photos and more information about what we did. We both got to travel a little bit. We actually got to see each other.
Yes.
Which is also rare for the podcast because, believe it or not, we do not record in the same place. And just a little bit more behind the scenes producing the podcast.
As well as fun things that we do to unwind. Like you mentioned, traveling. I followed the craze and I got a Tomodachi life. And there is someone that I want to introduce you all to. He's over on Patreon and he's just a little guy running around speaking in iambic pentameter. So if any of this intrigues you, please hop over to our Patreon, sign up, become a part of the community in order to learn more about not just the podcast itself, but Elise and I as, you know,
people.
The people behind the podcast.
Yeah. And speaking of Patreon, we have a whole bunch of Patreon patrons to thank. It's been a busy couple of months over there. So, thanks, and ever thanks to Kate P.,
Anne F.,
Sitcom Geeks,
Kim W.,
Richard C.,
Duran,
and Carly. We could not do this podcast without you. Now, let's dive into what we already know about fools. So, like we said at the top of the episode, we have covered fools before. We know that a fool or a clown was a specific position within the Lord Chamberlain's Men and the King's Men and theater companies of the early modern era. It was a specialized part, and these actors who were clowns and fools were specifically employed for their skills in clowning and fooling. It's like we've talked about it as like, it's like a Will Ferrell movie. Like, you go and you know that like it's going to be built around Will Ferrell's sensibilities and comedy and his specific brand of humor versus going and seeing a Mel Brooks movie, for example. So very different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe the more cerebral kind of comedy versus the more slapsticky comedy. There's a spectrum, or maybe not even a spectrum. There's categories.
Right. And we also know that Shakespeare worked primarily with two fools. Will Kemp, who specialized in the improvisatory. Is that a word?
It is now.
I'm not a fan of this room. I'm not a fan of this room. Okay.
We're going to power through.
Thank you. Will Kemp, who specialized in a more improv-based, more physical comedy, that slapstick, maybe more of even like a Charlie Chaplin, that Will Ferrell type. And then at some point, we know that Will Kemp left the company and was replaced by Robert Armin, who would take over the roles that Will Kemp originally played and have parts written for him. And Robert Armin is known for more of the courtier clown, the courtier fool, the witty fool, Lear's fool, and he also brings with him a talent for music. So Armin's fools tend to have songs that they sing, whereas Will Kemp has a little bit more like slapstick and not musical comedy. And he also usually has some form of a sidekick where Armin is solitary.
And a fun behind the scenes thing about my brain is whenever we talk about Robert Armin, my brain always has to tell me not to say Fred Armisen. I don't know why, but the two of them in my brain are this, like, they're not the same, but I want to confuse them. And it's great that Fred Armisen is also very funny, very musical. So maybe reborn, reincarnated Robert Armin.
I think very good contemporary.
Yeah.
Very good contemporary parallels to think about. I usually think about Will Ferrell for Will Kemp, and then I usually think about somebody like Steve Carell for Robert Armin, or like a Will Forte type. Yeah.
And in which case we need to have an offshoot project. This is just tangential, listeners, where we cast the roles that they likely played within their repertoire with modern comedic actors and say, who are we going to cast modern day? But I digress.
Yeah. And then what else do we know about fools?
We know that within Elizabethan society, outside of the world of the theater, fools were an official position within society, within the court, and there was the natural fool. And then there was also an artificial fool. Fooling is something that you have to be licensed for. There's a certain type of clothing that is worn to specify what kind of clown you are. And so those sorts of themes of like the court clown, the court fool also come into play on the Elizabethan stage.
Yeah. But today we're going to talk about Touchstone, which we mentioned in our Stuff to Chew On. There's debate over whether Will Kemp or Robert Armin, or both at one point, played Touchstone, because Touchstone exists in... I'm going to transition into my research now, because as the articles I read spoke to, Touchstone operates what Robert Hillis Goldsmith in Touchstone, A Critic in Motley calls a sort of like fool gray area. Touchstone is neither like distinctly an Armin role nor a Kemp role. And I read 3 articles that all brought different points to this sort of same idea of like Touchstone serves an important role in As You Like It. We don't necessarily know which fooling tradition he comes from. So my reading comes from, as I mentioned, Robert Hillis Goldsmith's Touchstone, A Critic in Motley, as well as Robert H. Bell's Motley to the View, The Shakespearean Performance of Folly, and David Frail's To the Point of Folly, Touchstone's Function in As You Like It. So Robert Bell exists at a point where Shakespeare is evolving his clowns from basic clowning of Will Kemp to a more sophisticated fooling. Bell notes that Touchstone tends to discourse, and, quote, instead of malapropisms, he crafts puns. The comedy has moved light years from the burlesque of Launce and his dog Crab, or the muddled doubles of Comedy of Errors, unquote. So Shakespeare is becoming a more sophisticated dramatist and creating his own voice in what the fool is instead of sort of playing to Kemp's strengths or necessarily like knowing Armin's strengths yet. Bell continues to argue that Bell is of it was a Armin role camp, but as we talked about in Stuff to Chew On, there's also a lot of evidence for it to be a Kemp role. So I'm not going to make a claim either way. One thing that Bell does point out, though, in this sort of development of how Shakespeare writes fools, is that Touchstone is an active participant in the play, rather than these earlier clowns who sort of exist outside of the action or are tangential to the main action, like Launce and Two Gents. Or you could even think about another Kemp role of Dogberry is sort of like tangential, like gets involved, but sort of exists in the periphery from the main action, versus Touchstone, who is directly engaged in what he's spoofing and what he's commenting on, which is much more like Festi or Lear's Fool, who are like the peak Armin clowns, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Touchstone's function in the play also sort of exists in this like gray area. Early on in the play, some historical critics have noted, and I'm going back to like the 1800s in this point, note that our noble characters like Celia and Rosalind call Touchstone a dull fool and a natural, but when he's in the forest, he's commended as a wise fool by Jaques and the Duke.
Mm-hmm.
For example, here are a couple quotes from these historical critics. Dr. Julius Thummel wrote that, quote, Touchstone disguises his wits when at Frederick's court, unquote. So this critic thought perhaps it's because Touchstone is being very smart and political and at Duke Frederick's court has to pretend to be stupid. Or perhaps when he gets to the forest where everyone is able to be a little bit more, true to themselves, he's able to reveal his intellect a little bit more. Georg Gottfried Gervinus says, Touchstone is, quote, not quite so expert nor so sensible of his wit as the fools in Twelfth Night and Lear, but, again, he is also not on the same ground as Costard, Launce, and Lancelot, unquote. So, again, he's existing in this sort of middle ground, both, which makes it hard to determine what is he doing here. And historical clowns, as we briefly talked about, Goldsmith argues that they, quote, served a double function, to entertain their masters or mistresses, and at the same time to minister to their sense of self-importance, unquote. So this could be what Touchstone is doing in the early scenes to the characters who see him as less than he is. He knows his function and uses parody instead of rhetoric to exercise his wit. He mimics Duke Senior, Jaques, and Orlando, and then in his wooing and wedding of Audrey, he is parodying Rosalind's thoughts on love. He also parodies the style and substance of pastoral verse, as well as the courtly manners and formal etiquette, serving as sort of what Goldsmith writes is a literary critic, something very rare in the fools of the plays of Shakespeare and his contemporaries. So Touchstone is also just not just being a fool, he's also critiquing the form that he's existing in.
Mm-hmm.
Again, he's also deferential to nobles who appreciate his intelligence. He pretends to be equals with Jaques, and then he patronizes the shepherds and country rustics in the same way that Rosalind and Celia call him a natural and call him a dull fool. He will be patronizing to the shepherds and country rustics. David Frale continues this line of thought of like Touchstone uses parody, is a parody of the main action of Rosalind and Orlando, and says that like those two would practice wooing forever and, quote, so preserve and heighten their desire, unquote, that it is a form of heightening their own passions for each other to just keep playing and to never actually reach marriage. However, Touchstone, in counterpoint, quickly woos, wins, and weds Audrey, and Frale argues that, quote, his hurry exposes the folly of the lover's elaboration and delay, unquote. Frale goes on to argue that Touchstone is the touchstone of As You Like It, and, quote, if Rosalind is the center of the play, Touchstone is the counter-center essential to its structural and textural relativity. Touchstone offers us a counter-meaning, an undoing of meaning, by snatching the play and us up to the point where paradoxes themselves dissolve into folly, unquote. So Touchstone is like always coming in to the middle of the play and taking it over and commenting on it, or providing a what Frale also calls As You Like It's, quote, kaleidoscopic structure and language, unquote, which creates this sort of like dizzying subjectivity for the audience of as you like it, right?
Right.
So this is mirrored by and from Touchstone. Frale continues that it's almost like Touchstone is like on the boundary of the stage and then steps into its center whenever he can to comment on. For example, in Act 1, Scene 2, he intrudes on Celia and Rosalind to deliver the message and cuts up their argument about what is natural for women and oaths and honor and love. He creates this like funhouse mirror version of their argument with them, showing that oaths, honor, love, logic, rhetoric, etc., everything that they've been talking about are all illusions and can all be twisted. So all of my reading suggested that primarily Touchstone serves as our central parody of the pastoral. All three of my articles, in their own ways, agree that Touchstone is this sort of central point to understanding as you like it, specifically the idea of as you like it being very subjective and as you like it. And they also all agree that he is a parody. He creates the parody inside of this play that is parodying the pastoral, which I'm sure we'll talk more about. And it's like, wow, what did Will Shakespeare really think about the pastoral genre?
Yeah.
And he also is, in creating this counterpoint to everything else that's going on in the show, a literal touchstone of the play. Last but not least, I do have another fun possibility.
All right.
Robert Hills Goldsmith in Touchstone, A Critic in Motley also suggests that perhaps Jaques could be a spoof on Sir John Harrington and other contemporary satirists, because Jaques is a bit of a satirist, is very, melancholy, and is a, bit of a counterpoint to Touchstone, a counterpoint to the counterpoint.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. Just,
yeah. Is another sort of mirror that this world is reflected through, and is, sort of very rigid in his thinking, whereas Touchstone his rhetoric is more fluid and seems to come more off the top of his head than Jaques, who seems to have been thinking about all the world's a stage for a long time.
And then Jaques also explains to Duke Senior the role of the fool in a very prescriptive way.
Mm-hmm. And Touchstone is more just existing.
Yeah.
So Touchstone also serves to point out this intended satire by, calling Jaques Mr. Whatchamacallit and providing sort of the counterpoint to the satire, a parody of satire. So essentially, by the end of reading all this, I was like, okay, so Touchstone is just Weird Al Yankovic of the pastoral genre.
Uh-huh.
He is here to parody everything that is happening, all of the pastoral love story, and also these contemporary satirists who Jaques embodies. And he's just here to show how ridiculous this all is.
Yeah, put a mirror up to
nature, as it were.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Or artifice.
Mm-hmm.
As we know from Twelfth Night, Shakespeare has a lot to say about the sort of artificiality of Petrarchan love poems,
yes,
right?
Yes.
So yeah, Touchstone is holding up a mirror, a funhouse mirror to all of that.
I also love, I just love the idea that rather than it being a mirror, it's enhanced by the funhouse part of it, which leads, I think, into the play of, the play in and of itself. Because reading the text, reading Touchstone's scenes for the synopsis, it's really hard to I intellectually understand the play, but to see it really provides opportunity to funhouse it versus it just being this cerebral activity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I love thinking about Touchstone as parody because I think it helps with what is he doing with Audrey.
Yeah.
Because if his entire point with Audrey is basically proving Rosalind wrong, I think that's much more, at least for me, that's way more interesting than he found a random lady he wants to marry.
Yeah.
It's well, yes, he did, but he's also doing it because he's you don't need to woo. You don't need to do all this.
Yeah.
You can just tell someone you like them. You can get the priest engaged before you actually get engaged to the person.
Yeah, you don't need all that courtly
There's no
courtship.
rules.
Yeah.
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 Or the courtly courtship's all made up.
Yeah.
So it's not something we have to be doing.
Totally. In the Forest of Arden, where the court is in the court, there's this ability to expose the ridiculousness of courtly manners, if you will.
Yeah. And like we talked about in Stuff to Chew On, it's that this is ridiculous, but also it only exists to make us different from others.
Mm-hmm.
All of the frippery and nonsense of the court exists to make the court what it is.
Yeah, which makes me wonder, whether or not Touchstone really believes genuinely what he's saying when he's squabbling with Corin about court manners versus country folk manners
Mm-hmm.
in that
Mm-hmm.
whole scene with, the civet and all that kind of stuff. But
Yeah.
yeah, wow.
Yeah. So that's my reading.
I think that's really grounding for the importance of Touchstone within the play.
Mm-hmm.
Because, yeah, Rosalind is the center, but then Touchstone is this kind of funhouse mirror character and is the kind of
Mm-hmm.
counter to Rosalind. And so I'm going to transition on over into my reading because you've set up Touchstone and his role in the play and where he exists with all these different characters within the text. And my reading takes a bit more of like a historical look back on the name Touchstone because what a name for Touchstone to call him Touchstone, make him this kind of touchstone. And the article that I read is called I Do Play the Touchstone and Testing and As You Like It by Lauren Windling. And this research uses a philological methodology. So I'm going to be looking at the history of words. And the word for today's research is touchstone. And so the title of this research is divided really into two pieces. One of them is Touchstone, the name of our central fool. And then Weinling also talks about testing in the play. And by testing, I mean the act of testing. As You Like It is full of testing. Characters test other characters. They test their identity, they test their values, and Weinling argues that they do this in order to ease anxieties and mistrust in a world full of uncertain friendships and allegiances. And you mentioned there's the court, there's the forest, there's all these different relationships.
Oh, yeah. Because especially with like this place starts in a place where there's been a usurpation of the Duke. So like there's courtly intrigue. Like who do you know who to trust or who's gonna, exile you?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Before the play, we have this. At the top of the play, we have this with poor Rosalind. So by testing, it's, a critical examination, observation, or evaluation, and Touchstone's role in this idea of testing and As You Like It. And like there's a specific origin to Touchstone's namesake. A touchstone is a stone meant to test gold's authenticity by scratching the material in question against its surface. It's a cool object to look at. I googled it and it's just like literally a black stone that rub gold or silver on and it shows whether or not it's truly gold or a fool's gold. And then you also mentioned another definition for touchstone. So there's like the material object, the stone. A touchstone, it also is a criterion or reference point by which something is assessed or judged. So he's a touchstone in the play amongst all these different characters. He's kind of like a reference point to assess or judge something. Fun fact, I'm not going to dive into this, but while we're diving into Touchstone, the name may also be a playful allusion to actor Robert Armin's history because Robert Armin was an apprentice goldsmith.
Okay, another point to the Armin camp.
Yeah, so over the course of this series, hopefully we'll be able to deliberate. We'll have a final conclusion,
Yeah.
And Weinling notes that Touchstone has been interpreted by scholars in many different ways. There's the idea that he's a wise fool and a cultural critic. Others say that Touchstone is, quote, a leveler who goes about puncturing pretense and testing this golden world for fool's gold, unquote. So again, like the stone testing gold purity.
So literally testing, and like when you say the golden world, that's like the Forest of Arden, this utopia, idyllic place. He's testing its boundaries to see if it's
Exactly.
okay.
Yeah, yeah. There's also the interpretation that Albert Ascoli argues that Shakespeare found the name Touchstone in the source material, Thomas Lodge's Rosalind, and is referencing a line, quote, let time be the touchstone of friendships, unquote. And this touchstone, Weinling argues, tests allegiances or friendships. And then DJ Palmer says Touchstone reflects the nature he confronts. So, as you mentioned, like holding up that, I prefer the funhouse mirror rather than just a regular old mirror, but holding that up and reflecting nature or artifice, you mentioned. But little or cursory treatment has been given to his, as Weinling calls, rather strange name. In fact, most critics, quote, no longer accept Celia's judgment that Touchstone is a mere whetstone or sharpening stone of wits, but the other interpretations that Weinling mentioned above remains to this scholar, superficial, sidestepping some rather troubling aspects of Touchstone's testing, unquote. So we're going to dive a little bit into Touchstone in tandem with testing in As You Like It. And Touchstone's testing does make sense when looking at the collective anxiety from the cast of characters in the Forest of Arden. The court brings their political baggage to the forest, and they worry about whom to trust and which political allegiances to hold, if any. And a question is, but why? And Weinling posits that such anxieties could be contextualized by Elizabethan religious and political tensions. In particular, Protestants versus Catholics. And the forest is a utopia to resolve this conflict. Weinling begins with a semantic explanation of the name touchstone through its usage in early modern print material. So, yes, we know that a touchstone is a stone that's used to test authenticity of gold, but during the early modern period, the touchstone figure held a metaphor that appeared in contexts of religious doctrine, secular discussions of value, and political and religious allegiances. In this case, it stands for some method that would both procure and assure true information about the object or person in question. This metaphor, this touchstone metaphor, implied a measure of violence, and it had a troubling connotation in Elizabethan England. Here is touchstone in early modern print material. The Oxford English Dictionary dates the word touchstone's origins to about 1389, likely inspired by the Middle French equivalent pierre de touche designating a test of precious metal, so similar like the touchstone, just in the French language. But stories of the period in reference books use this touchstone metaphor as a test that guaranteed truth. Weinling did a keyword search of the early English books online database, and this resulted in 251 texts between 1570 and 1610 that used the word touchstone a collective of 437 times. Of those uses, only 5 reference a touchstone as a goldsmith's tool.
Oh.
The remaining are metaphorical in contexts of religion, literature, natural science, manuals or handbooks, and the law. And roughly 70% of these uses reference religious dissent between Protestants and Catholics.
Wait, what was that number again?
70%.
Okay, so it's a much more common usage to be about like this religious, I don't know, I'm not saying it correctly, but
yeah, this like religious and political dissent.
Yeah, so the sort of, I think, our contemporary sense of it like being something that like an argument is like pinned upon and like centers around, that is the usage that we're dealing with in Shakespeare's day. That's a lot more common than the gold.
Yes, exactly.
Even though the gold is cool.
It's very cool. It's very, very cool. But it's been repurposed for this discourse that exists.
Yeah, so by Shakespeare's time, touchstone means like a key point in an argument.
And I will get to a little bit more specific about like what the touchstone is within this discourse in print material.
Ooh, okay.
And we see this in a secular context. So the touchstone could test relationships and persons, i.e. allegiances. And we see that in Thomas Howell's 1581 poem that tests friends from flatterers, as well as William Pollitt's Commonplace book, which underlines that hardship is necessary for knowing a person's character and their allegiances, as well as Bernardino de Mendoza's 1597 translation, Theorique and Practice of War, which states that, quote, suffering and travails are the touchstone of a soldier's true valor, unquote. And Thomas Lodge, who I referenced earlier, advocates for testing courtiers' loyalty. And it's with this that I, in my notes, wrote a reminder that, quote, testing with the touchstone is a physical, abrasive practice that puts pressure on the object via this stone, unquote. Like the literal material touchstone that is testing actual gold. It's a physical, abrasive practice. And so it's assumed that this practice, metaphorically, will discover the truth. Weinling writes that this testing, quote, inherently intimates a kind of violent process of scratching, which metaphorically extends to hardship, unquote. And then Weinling continues that in these metaphors, inquisitors are not trying to find true gold, but instead to prove the subject's falsity. And the search presumes guilt that justifies the violent ordeal. So there's this presupposition that You are testing somebody, you're putting them through hardship because you already have predetermined that somebody is false rather than that they're true.
Got it.
And this is evident when the touchstone metaphor tests are based in a religious context. So, in this context, the touchstone metaphor marked the test of God's truth and who possessed it. So, you were like a step ahead of me.
I don't think I had that God's truth and who possessed it as like I wasn't quite there yet.
But you were on the right track. And most often, Protestants and occasionally Catholics cited scripted or God's word as the quote, touchstone of truth, unquote, which tests the verity of doctrine or religious practices. The natural philosopher John Bate used the metaphor of a touchstone to argue for testing hypocrites to expose their sin in the Portraiture of Hypocrisies from 1589. He justifies violent speech and action, which he calls, quote, being touched, unquote, to unearth the hypocrite. And this use of a touchstone is to expose the sinfulness of papists, again, Roman Catholics. And we've talked a bit about the Protestants and the Catholics and that tension with the, Church of England and then recusant Catholics. And in Elizabethan England, discovering papists was not just a matter of religion, but one of state. The state, a Protestant state, anxiously searched for an effective method to find Catholic traitors, especially after assassination attempts like the Babington Plot. And I think we mentioned the Babington Plot once in some episode, but just as a reminder, it was a 1586 plot to assassinate Elizabeth and put her Catholic cousin Mary on the throne. And there were other historical moments like discovering the Jesuit spy Edmund Campion in 1581 and his subsequent arrest, torture, and execution. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered that influenced this violence, right? There are these traitorous Catholics, these underground secret Catholics, and we have to find them, we have to punish them.
Right. And torture them. And
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. And so during this period, the metaphorical use of the touchstone was applied to England's, quote, century of torture, unquote, when torture was the chosen method for discovering potential threats. And Puritan clergyman John Udall warned that, quote, the touchstone of God's words, unquote, offers assurance that false men will be discovered as, quote, being fraught with all sin and iniquity, unquote. So that's one example of associating like the touchstone and sin and whatnot. And then a legal scholar named William Fulbeck uses the touchstone metaphor to hint at violent methods as a response to man's false testimony in the law, as in a man is going to lie in his testimony and you have to use violence against him. So again, this like presupposition that somebody is being false. And a 1597 New Year's gift dedicated to the Pope's Holiness from 1579, which was a satire, we're back here with some satire, that was written for Elizabeth, wrote, quote, whereto I pray thee, gentle reader, have a special regard, and amongst the rest, mark our double-faced papists, which, Janus-like in court and elsewhere, does make their boast to be the Queen's Majesty's faithful subjects, comparable with the best Protestants. But when it comes to the trial and touchstone, to know what they think of the supremacy, then they cleave to the Pope, having no fear of God, no love to the Queen, nor no dread of justice. For in denying the supremacy, they take from the Queen's Highness Her Majesty regal authority, and the due obedience which she ought to have of her subjects. And most traitorously, they renounce their faith, loyalty, service, and obedience, which they owe to her excellency, so as they make themselves quick sacrifices to the devil, and manyest traitorous to the Queen. So in this satire, the satirist is writing about how Catholic traitors will pretend to be, they are double-faced. They're Janus-like in the court, and they do their best to pretend to be the Queen's faithful subjects and act like the best Protestants. But behind closed doors, they are like liars. They're traitors.
Yeah. They will lie to your face, and they are like, I don't know why, but I was like, oh, so they're writing a burn book behind your back. Like they're,
Yeah.
yeah, Your Majesty. Like they cannot be trusted. And the only way to tell is through this trial and touchstone.
Mm-hmm. And so a trial denotes a juridical proceeding, and then a touchstone indicates a spiritual or likely a physical one, if we remember the like scratching process of the literal touchstone object. But yeah, the trial is juridical, the touchstone is spiritual or physical. Trial and touchstone are like paired together in the writings by these religious leaders and writers of the time. Weinling notes that the word touch appears to be used synonymously with torture in some of these texts, notably in the third volume of the Holinshed Chronicles from 1586, when it recounted the torture by the Elizabethan government in the case of Edmund Campion and Sir Francis Throckmorton. And Holinshed, in this publication of the Chronicle, asks if the law can, quote, touch or torture traitors. And he writes that torture is the only remaining means for princes to discover treason. And in defense of Elizabeth, he affirms this kind of like torture touch practice for seeking out traitors to the state.
Wow. Also, I think that's just, I was just like, oh yeah, Holinshed. We definitely know Shakespeare read that.
Mm-hmm. He 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. Luckily, though, not everyone agreed with Holinshed's conclusion that like torture is the way to find out truths.
Sure. I hope not.
Not a monolith, not a monolith. And a Puritan politician named Francis Hastings wrote in 1600 that being quote unquote touched or tormented, right, where touch and torture have the same, they're used interchangeably within these kinds of pieces of discourse. But being touched or tormented does not mean a Catholic would reveal their inner thoughts and prefers to judge men by their actions with no coercion or force to reveal. So this Puritan politician is like, his philosophy is the opposite of what Holinshed and the state were advocating for, to seek out and find traitors to the state.
Got it.
And Weinling wonders if Shakespeare shared Hastings' opinion, right? That like maybe we shouldn't torment people to get answers out of them and like to seek out and try treasonous people. And so Weinling looks at the word touchstone in Shakespeare's plays. The word touchstone is only used once outside of As You Like It in Pericles, but Shakespeare does use the metaphor as a shorthand or a verb, so that word touch. He uses it a few times, like in Henry IV, Part 1, King John, and Timon of Athens, all in reference to finding falsity in someone. Shakespeare also references the violence of the touchstone in The Merry Wives of Windsor and in Richard III. Richard even says he will, quote, play the touch, unquote, engaging in an interrogation and a testing of, I think it's Buckingham. And in As You Like It, Weinling argues that, quote, Touchstone's name activates a vocabulary for testing someone's character, testimony, or allegiance in a historical moment when allegiances to the English church and crown were a source of great anxiety. Whether or not that testing always involved the torture in which Holinshed and Hastings allude, making the figurative metaphor based on a physical test of gold literal once again, this testing certainly implied some measure of violence, unquote. And just a heads up, Weinling does not advocate for, in practice, having a violent touchstone. So I just want to say up front, this is not making As You Like It dark in a way that is inappropriate for a comedy.
No, I think what I'm getting from it though is that Touchstone, it sort of aligns with what I was talking about of like Touchstone is this funhouse mirror, and he's maybe like the funhouse mirror that they have to walk through. They have to like through the looking glass prove what is their truth. And he is sort of like one of the first people who like is changed in the forest. Like he sort of immediately is the like smart, intelligent fool that, you know, the nobles in the first few scenes don't say he is. And so maybe he is in his parodying and in his spoofing of what everyone else is doing in the forest, he is helping like test their truth and what they want out of the experience of the forest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that this is a great time. Like you're literally one step before like all my points. Like you're nailing it. Because I want to talk about As You Like It and the character anxieties. These characters' anxieties and like Touchstone's kind of role. So in As You Like It, characters' anxieties concern distinctions between people. So there's anxiety around noble and common, wise and foolish, and especially ally and enemy. The character's interrogating language probes others' identities, testing them to get truths from persons. Rosalind and Celia, at the top of the play, desire a touchstone to test others in the forest, and they bring Touchstone with them to test the identities of those they meet in the forest. For example, Rosalind as Ganymede beckons Touchstone to greet Corin and Silvius in the forest. Rosalind says, "Look you who comes here," and Touchstone tests the strangers. So identities in the forest can be revealed as true or counterfeit by some reliable interrogative method or instrument. And in this case, it's Touchstone. The anxieties that lead to testing are exhibited in other characters, and they begin at the court. Most notably, Duke Frederick believes that with enough time and testing, Rosalind will be put under enough pressure and tested to finally reveal herself to be a traitor like her father, Duke Sr., because treason is something that can be inherited. So Duke Frederick has already determined that Rosalind is a traitor. And so he thinks that if he tests her enough, that falsity will be revealed.
Which is super similar to what was happening in these, like, Protestant Catholic discourse testing.
Yes. Rosalind, on the other hand, pronounces her love for Orlando by underscoring her family history. And what I mean by that is that Orlando's father was an ally to Rosalind's, so Orlando can be an ally to Rosalind. She says, quote, "Had I before known this young man his son, I should have given him tears unto entreaties," unquote. That was like the test for her being able to actually like him, because he is an ally, because their fathers were allies.
Yeah, so she would have, if she had known, she would have added tears to her, like, pleas for him to not risk his life wrestling. She would have done more to save him from wrestling.
Yeah, but now that it's revealed, and we get the rest of the play. And so the innate nature of a person or a thing cannot be hidden from view. One just needs the appropriate instrument with which to reveal it, is how a touchstone acts within As You Like It. And then in the Forest of Arden, we get our first threat of violence when Orlando attempts a heist to get food for Adam from Duke Sr.'s banquet. Orlando's first order of business is that he needs, quote, his affairs answered, unquote, a test to know who these people are. Are they friends or are they enemies? Duke Sr. then picks up the interrogation/test from Orlando. So the interrogation and the testing goes from Orlando's hands to Duke Sr.'s. When Orlando and Adam return for hospitality and they dine with him, Duke Sr. will, quote, question Orlando about his fortunes, unquote, which he's testing him to get, and he's getting a testimony. And in that, he discovers that Orlando is Sir Roland's son, so he is an ally. In spite of all of this searching for truth through testing, again, these characters are testing friendships and allegiances. Touchstone, Weinling argues, refuses the role of his namesake. Quote, instead of revealing the truths that his companions are after, he illustrates first that these truths are not stable or innate, but constructed or performed. And second, that the touchstone method can have very real violent implications for those subjected to it, unquote. And then Weinling uses two scenes, the civet scene, Act 3, Scene 2, and then the Good William scene in Act 5, Scene 1. And she uses these as a model for this argument. Weinling also notes that often these scenes are cut in production due to appearing frivolous or no longer particularly funny. And we'll put a pin in this and see if productions in our wrap-up include the civet and the Good William scene. But I digress. So in Act 3, Scene 2, Touchstone and Corin squabble over basically the town mouse and the country mouse fable. When Corin says that he's never been to court, Touchstone responds, quote, why, if thou never wast at court, thou never saw'st good manners? If thou never saw'st good manners, then thy manners must be wicked, and wickedness is sin, and sin is damnation. Thou art in a parlous state, shepherd, unquote. So the first point is that Touchstone is using this good versus wicked manners argument to say that there are natural states of good courtiers versus sinful country folk in this argument. Secondly, the word parlous, it can be an alteration of the word perilous, so a perilous state, and that signifies danger or uncertainty that can be read within the context of the contemporary Touchstone metaphor. What I mean by that is when we're talking about like states of good versus wicked manners, if we go back to this Protestant versus Catholic discourse, and then also the century of torture, I don't want to discredit that and just call it discourse, but the manner of a Catholic, so taking communion and confession, it became an identity that predetermined their damnation and their treacherous intentions according to English Protestants. So that's like the first setup. But then the scene continues, and Corin and Touchstone, they have this tit for tat about other court versus country manners. And finally, Corin resigns. he's like, okay, I'm done with this. He's like, okay, you win. And Touchstone asks, quote, wilt thou rest damned? God help thee, shallow man. God make incision in thee. Thou art raw, unquote. And Weinling argues that using the semantics of the touchstone metaphor, if we look at the word incision, you test something or someone by making an incision to reveal their insides. He doesn't end up, making an incision or anything, but like Touchstone has predetermined that Corin is a shallow man. So an incision doesn't need to be made, but the incision or the test of like revealing his insides, his inner self, would settle Touchstone's claim that Corin is damned and shallow. And if we look at the testing of persons in the Elizabethan state, does that make sense?
I think so, yes. So, like, Touchstone has already come into this being like, if he is acting as this, like, touchstone, like it was used in context during this time, he's testing Corin's court ability to, knowledge of the court and, like, worthiness thereof. And because Corin lacks it, which Touchstone goes into this interaction knowing, he basically proves his own point.
Yeah.
And is basically doing a version of this sort of like Touchstone testing that was being done when interrogating Catholics or Protestants, depending on who was running the Church of England.
Yeah,
right?
But primarily the Protestants to the Catholics.
Yes, during this time. Yeah, during Shakespeare's lifetime. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Just wanted to make sure.
And it's also, and it's also like, oh, here's another thing that's like being parodied. Here's another thing that's being like, where Touchstone is like showing a mirror up to the court, up to like, also this idea, the pastoral of like, if you idealize the pastoral so much, like this is what we're actually talking about though, is the reality of living in Warwickshire.
Yeah.
And being from the country is not what you think it is.
Totally. Yeah. It's like the two sides of it, like parodying the country versus town, and then also parodying the predetermined like trials and touchstone that the Protestants were using to prosecute Catholics and like hold up that funhouse mirror. And I have one other example from the Good William scene. Touchstone uses language of the touchstone in pursuit of his own desires by illustrating the instrument's intrinsic violence. So what I mean by the instrument, I mean like the actual touchstone, and you like scratch and you put pressure on to discover if gold is true or false. So in this scene, Touchstone threatens violence against William to pressure William to give up his pursuit of Audrey. Touchstone says, quote, or to wit, I kill thee, make thee away, translate thy life into death, thy liberty into bondage. I will deal in poison with thee, or in bastinado, or in steel. I will bandy with thee in faction. I will o'errun thee with policy. I will kill thee 150 ways, unquote. And Weinling likens this to an inquisition. And in this quote, like Touchstone references factions and policy, perhaps similar to those of the dukedom's political factions, or widening out, zooming out the factions and policies of Elizabethan England. And in this kind of violence, Weinling notes that it's an exposure of the touchstone metaphor for what it is. Quote, a method to obtain one's desires, framing an enemy or threatening one's opposition, unquote. So like this metaphor threat of violence is not out of good faith. It's you presuppose or have predetermined that somebody is false. And it's oftentimes for wanting a desire. And so in order to get that, you have to frame an enemy or threaten somebody to maybe get a Catholic to admit that they're a traitor, like for Touchstone to get Audrey. But in the end, Touchstone's violent test is actually ineffective compared to Audrey's simple request, do good, William.
Yeah.
So in this situation, that touch or that torture of policy or law that Holinshed advocates for might be equally ineffectual at discovering the truth. So in this sense, maybe in this scene, Shakespeare through Touchstone is putting up again that funhouse mirror to the actual effectiveness of this policy that was happening in Elizabethan England as it pertained to the Protestants versus the Catholics, and the anxieties that the Elizabethan crown and state had around perceived treason and traitors everywhere. You got to find them out. You've got to trial and touchstone them. And through this kind of torture, we will be able to figure out our enemies. And it's like, that's actually ineffective. Like, people lie when they're being tortured. Like, this is not going to actually discover truth.
Right.
So In conclusion, quote, while having a touchstone, even a metaphorical one, on which to depend promises solace and comfort in a period of political unrest, as Touchstone highlights, the touchstone method is deeply flawed, since distinctions amongst persons are neither inherited nor stable. Thus, the audience ought to question whether or not this method is sound both when it seems to presume guilt and when it doesn't unearth true identities, so much as construct them with either threatened or realized violence, unquote. One last thing that I think is just a great note from this article is, quote, what remains at the level of suggestion beneath the surface in Arden's comedy becomes actualized in some of Shakespeare's other plays, because Weinling talks about Falstaff and Merry Wives and Richard III. But what remains at the level of suggestion beneath the surface in Arden's comedy becomes actualized in the history play, Richard III, just as it did in England's history outside of the theater, unquote. And the touchstone test does not work because the truth will not become evident under duress, but rather, quote, one finds traitors or enemies of state because they were forced to play their parts, unquote.
I think this is like super fascinating, and like it also reminds me of the Sirtopus scene from Twelfth Night.
Mm-hmm.
That is a sort of like a fool performing a test on someone who has sinned, essentially, again, done wrong, and getting Malvolio to admit that he's done wrong. They have to do this like thing that sometimes productions struggle with, of like, why are we being so mean to Malvolio?
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that, as you were speaking, I also thought about, to wrap this up, what do you do with this information for
Yeah.
As You Like It
Yeah.
and Touchstone? And I think that, one, for me, I was like, oh, well, that's another thing that I've seen people struggle with, is like, why is Touchstone just such a jerk to people sometimes? Yeah. And I think that what I'm taking away from this is that he is, one, there's like a parody, a sarcasm, he's not a like jokey clown, nor is he, a satirist, but he is poking fun he's roasting these norms and these courtly ideals, and also then he's, performing these tests of like what to find out like what is true. And yeah, they're harsh. And by giving them to the fool, it points out how harsh they are. And I think that's something that's sort of like, I would be interested in like tackling a production with that knowledge, either like directing or something, and giving Touchstone just a little bit more of like, he's not being a jerk, so how do we not make him a jerk? He's doing specific, like, these are actually like very specific things that he's doing. Yeah. Not just like joking around.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that'd be really fascinating too. Like, because I did struggle, like at the end of this, I was like, okay, well, what do I do with this? Like, obviously, we're not going to make Touchstone be violent and test people violently.
Except for William.
Yeah, that ineffective threat.
Mm-hmm. And then he also like talks about like, it's also interesting because he has the enumeration of the lie, which is an enumeration of a duel. Mm-hmm. Is a take on the steps to a duel, right? But he's talking about like all the different types of lies and like how it was about to come to a duel, but then if there is much an if, and so like they don't end up going to a duel. And I think that, yeah, the whole thing is just like this parody. He is just this like parody of the norms of the court, as well as pointing out their false understanding of the country.
Yeah, because this is also a political world where like it is kind of life or death, whether or not, you are in good favor with someone or not, or who you were in allegiance with. And so I love how you describe Touchstone as this like fun house mirror up to society and these norms and these in the bigger scope of like Elizabethan state and the crown's policies. This is all just like parody fun house, like putting this mirror up to everything, and like nothing's off limits really when it comes to Touchstone.
And with that, thank you for listening.
I'm Courtney Smith.
And I'm Elise Sharp.
This is Shakespeare Anyone?
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare Anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Never Ending Minute by Sounds Like Sander.
If you would like to support us, visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. You can also hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it. For more, you can visit our website, shakespeareanyone.com, or follow us on Instagram at ShakespeareAnyonePod.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here is a completely random Shakespeare quote for you.
From Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1, said by Hamlet. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied over with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment with disregard their currents turn away and lose the name of action.